Wind, Sand, and Stars. Chapter 8. Prisoner of the Sand. Part 2. Off to Benghazi. We still have 2 hours of daylight. Before we crossed into Tripolitana, I took off my glare glasses. The sands were golden under the slanting rays of the sun. How empty of life is this planet of ours. Once again, it struck me that its rivers, its woods, its human habitations were the product of chance, of fortuitous conjunctions of circumstance. What a deal of the earth's surface is given over to rock and sand. But all this was not my affair. My world was the world of flight. Already I could feel the oncoming night, within which I should be enclosed, as in the precincts of a temple, enclosed in the temple of night for the accomplishment of secret rites and absorptions in inviolable contemplation. Already this profane world was beginning to fade out. Soon it would vanish altogether. This landscape was still laved in golden sunlight, but already something was evaporating out of it. I know nothing in the world, equal to the wonder of nightfall in the air. Those who have been enthralled by the witchery of flying will know what I mean, and I do not speak of the men who, among other sports, enjoy taking a turn in a plane. I speak of those who fly professionally and have sacrificed much to their craft. Mermos said once, "It's worth it. It's worth the final smash-up." No question about it, but the reason is hard to formulate. A novice taking orders could appreciate this ascension towards the essence of things, since his profession, too, is one of renunciation. He renounces the world, he renounces riches, he renounces the love of a woman, and by renunciation he discovers his hidden God. I, too, in this flight, am renouncing things. I am giving up the broad golden surfaces that would befriend me if my engines were to fail. I am giving up the landmarks by which I might be taking my bearings. I am giving up the profiles of mountains against the sky that would warn me of pitfalls. I am plunging into the night. I am navigating. I have on my side only the stars. The diurnal death of the world is a slow death. It is only little by little that the divine beacon of daylight recedes from me. Earth and sky begin to merge into each other. The earth rises and seems to spread like a mist. The first stars tremble as if shimmering in green water. Hours must pass before their glimmer hardens into the frozen glitter of diamonds. I shall have a long wait before I witness the soundless frolic of the shooting stars. In the profound darkness of certain nights I have seen the sky streaked with so many trailing sparks that it seemed to me a great gale must be blowing through the outer heavens. Prévost was testing the lamps in their sockets and the emergency torches. Round the bulbs he was wrapping red paper. Another layer. He added another wrapping of paper and touched a switch. The dim light within the plane was still too bright. As in a photographer's dark room, it veiled the pale picture of the external world. It hid that glowing phosphorescence which, sometimes at night, clings to the surface of things. Now night has fallen, but it is not yet true night. A crescent moon persists. Prévost dove aft and came back with a sandwich. I nibbled a bunch of grapes. I was not hungry. I was neither hungry nor thirsty. I felt no weariness. It seemed to me that I could go on like this at the controls for 10 years. I was happy. The moon had set. It was pitch dark when we came in sight of Benghazi. The town lay at the bottom of an obscurity so dense that it was without a halo. I saw the place only when I was over it. As I was hunting for the aerodrome, the red obstruction lights were switched on. They cut out a black rectangle in the earth. I banked, and at that moment the rays of a floodlight rose into the sky like a jet from a fire hose. It pivoted and traced a golden lane over the landing field. I circled again to get a clear view of what might be in my way. The port was equipped with everything to make a night landing easy. I throttled down my engine and dropped like a diver into black water. It was 11 o'clock local time when I landed and taxied across to the beacon. The most helpful ground crew in the world wove in and out of the blinding ray of a searchlight, alternately visible and invisible. They took my papers and began to promptly fill my tanks. 20 minutes of my time was all they asked for, and I was touched by their great readiness to help. As I was taking off, one of them said, "Better circle round than fly over us, otherwise we shan't be sure you got off all right." I rolled down the golden lane towards an unimpeded opening. My simoon lifted her overload clear of the ground well before I reached the end of the runway. The searchlight following me made it hard for me to wheel. Soon it let me go. The men on the ground had guessed that it was dazzling me. I turned right about and banked vertically, and at that moment the searchlight caught me between the eyes again, but scarcely had it touched me when it fled and sent elsewhere its long golden flute. I knew that the ground crew were being most thoughtful, and I was grateful. And now I was off to the desert. All along the line, at Paris, at Tunis, and at Benghazi, I had been told that I should have a following wind of up to 25 miles an hour. I was counting on a speed of 190 miles per hour as I set my course on the middle of the stretch between Alexandria and Cairo. On this course I should avoid the danger zones along the coast, and despite any drifting I might do without knowing it, I should pick up, either to port or to starboard, the lights of one of those two cities. Failing them, I should certainly not miss the lights of the Nile Valley. With a steady wind, I should reach the Nile in 3 hours and 20 minutes. If the wind fell, 3 hours and 3/4. Calculating thus, I began to eat up the 650 miles of desert ahead of me. There was no moon. The world was a bubble of pitch that had dilated until it reached the very stars in the heavens. I should not see a single gleam of light, should not profit by the faintest landmark. Carrying no wireless, I should receive no message from the earth until I reached the Nile. It was useless to try and look at anything other than the compass and the artificial horizon. I might blot the world out of my mind and concentrate my attention upon the slow pulsation of the narrow thread of radium paint that ran along the dark background of the dials. Whenever Prévost stirred, I brought the plane smoothly back to plumb. I went up to 6,000 feet, where I had been told the winds would be favorable. At long intervals, I switched on a lamp to glance at the engine dials, not all of which were phosphorescent, but most of the time I wrapped myself closely round in darkness, among my miniature constellations which gave off the same mineral glow as the stars, the same mysterious and unwearied light, and spoke the same language. Like the astronomers, I too was reading in the book of celestial mechanics. I too seemed to myself studious and uncorrupted. Everything in the world that might have lured me from my studies had gone out. The external world had ceased to exist. There was Prévost, who, after a vain resistance, had fallen asleep and left me to the greater enjoyment of my solitude. There was the gentle purr of my beautiful little motor, and before me, on the instrument panel, there were all those tranquil stars. I was most decidedly not sleepy. If this state of quiet well-being persisted until tomorrow night, I intended to push on without a stop to Saigon. Now the flight was beginning to seem to me short. Benghazi The only troublesome night landing on the route had banked its fires and settled down behind the horizon in that dark shuddering in which cities take their slumber. Meanwhile, I was turning things over in my mind. We were without the moon's help, and we had no wireless. No slightest tenuous tie was to bind us to Earth until the Nile showed its thread of light directly ahead of us. We were truly alone in the universe, a thought that caused me not the least worry. If my motor were to cough, that sound would startle me more than if my heart should skip a beat. Into my mind came the image of Sabatier, the white-haired engineer with the clear eye. I was thinking that, from one point of view, it would be hard to draw a distinction in the matter of human values between a profession like his and that of the painter, the composer, or the poet. I could see in the mind's eye those watchmaker's hands of his that had brought into being this clockwork I was piloting. Men who have given their lives to labors of love go straight to my heart. Couldn't I change this? I had asked him. I shouldn't advise it, he had answered. I was remembering our last conversation. He had thought it inadvisable, and of course that had settled it. A physician, that's it. Exactly the way one puts oneself into the hands of one's doctor, when he has that look in his eye. It was by his motor that we hung suspended in the air and were able to go on living with the ticking of time in this penetrable pitch. We were crossing the great dark valley of a fairy tale, the valley of ordeal. Like the prince in the tale, we must meet the test without succor. Failure here would not be forgiven. We were in the lap of the inexorable gods. A ray of light was filtering through a joint in the lamp shaft. I woke up Prévost and told him to put it out. Prévost stirred in the darkness like a bear, snorted, and came forward. He fumbled for a bit with handkerchiefs and black paper, and the ray of light vanished. That light had bothered me because it was not of my world. It swore at the pale and distant gleam of the phosphorescence, and was like a nightclub spotlight compared to the gleam of a star. Besides, it had dazzled me and outshone all else that gleamed. We had been flying for 3 hours. A brightness that seemed to me a glare spurted on the starboard side. I stared. A streamer of light, which I had hitherto not noticed, was fluttering from a lamp at the tip of the wing. It was an intermittent glow, now brilliant, now dim. It told me that I had flown into a cloud, and it was on the cloud that the lamp was reflected. I was nearing the landmarks upon which I had counted. A clear sky would have helped a lot. The wing shone bright under the halo. The light steadied itself, became fixed, and then began to radiate in the form of a bouquet of pink blossoms. Great eddies of air were swinging me to and fro. I was navigating somewhere in the belly of a cumulus, whose thickness I could not guess. I rose to 7,500 feet, and was still in it. Down again to 3,000, and the bouquet of flowers was still with me, motionless and growing brighter. Well, there it was, and there was nothing to do about it. I would think of something else and wait to get clear of it. Just the same, I did not like this sinister glitter of a one-eyed grog shop. Let me think, I said to myself. I am bouncing round a bit, but there's nothing abnormal about that. I've been bumped all the way, despite a clear sky and plenty of ceiling. The wind has not died down, and I must be doing better than the 190 miles per hour I counted on. This was about as far as I could get. Oh, well, then when I got through the cloud bank, I would try to take my bearings. Out of it we flew. The bouquet suddenly vanished, letting me know I was in the clear again. I stared ahead and saw, if one can speak of seeing, space, a narrow valley of sky and the wall of the next cumulus. Already the bouquet was coming to life again. I was free of that viscous mess from time to time, but only for a few seconds each time. After 3.5 hours of flying, it began to get on my nerves. If I had made the time I imagined, we were certainly approaching the Nile. With a little luck, I might be able to spot the river through the rifts, but they were getting rare. I dared not come down, for if I was actually slower than I thought, I was still over high-lying country. Thus far, I was entirely without anxiety. My only fear was that I might presently be wasting time. I decided that I would take things easy until I had flown 4.25 hours. After that, even in a dead calm, which was highly unlikely, I should have crossed the Nile. When I reached the fringes of the cloud bank, the bouquet winked on and off more and more swiftly, and then suddenly went out. Decidedly, I did not like these dot and dash messages from the demons of the night. A green star appeared ahead of me, flashing like a lighthouse. Was it a lighthouse? Or really a star? I took no pleasure from the supernatural gleam, this star the Magi might have seen, this dangerous decoy. Prévost, meanwhile, had waked up, and turned his electric torch on the engine dials. I waved him off, him and his torch. We had just sailed into the clear between two clouds, and I was busy staring below. Prévost went back to sleep. The gap in the clouds was no help. There was nothing below. 4 hours and 5 minutes in the air. Prévost awoke and sat down beside me. "I'll bet we're near Cairo," he said. "We must be." "What's that, a star? Or is it a lighthouse?" I had throttled the engine down a little. This, probably, was what had awakened Prévost. He is sensitive to all the variations of sound in flight. I began a slow descent, intending to slip under the mass of clouds. Meanwhile, I had had a look at my map. One thing was sure, the land below me lay at sea level, and there was no risk of conking against a hill. Down I went, flying due north so that the lights of the cities would strike square into my windows. I must have overflown them, and should therefore see them on my left. Now I was flying below the cumulus, but alongside was another cloud hanging lower down on the left. I swerved so as not to be caught in its net, and headed north-northeast. This second cloud bank certainly went down a long way, for it blocked my view of the horizon. I dared not give up any more altitude. My altimeter registered 1,200 feet. But I had no notion of the atmospheric pressure here. Prévost leaned towards me, and I shouted to him, "I'm going out to sea. I'd rather come down on it than risk a crash here." As a matter of fact, there was nothing to prove that we had not drifted over the sea already. Below that cloud bank, visibility was exactly nil. I hogged my window, trying to read below me, to discover flares, signs of life. I was a man raking dead ashes, trying in vain to retrieve the flame of life in a hearth. A lighthouse! Both of us spied it at the same moment, that winking decoy. What madness! Where was that phantom light, that invention of the night? For at the very second when Prévost and I leaned forward to pick it out of the air, where it had glittered 900 feet below our wings, suddenly, at that very instant... Oh. I am quite sure this was all I said. I am quite sure that all I felt was a terrific crash that rocked our world to its foundations. We had crashed against the earth at 170 miles an hour. I am quite sure that in the split second that followed, all I expected was the great flash of a ruddy light of the explosion in which Prévost and I were to be blown up together. Neither he nor I had felt the least emotion of any kind. All I could observe in myself was an extraordinary tense feeling of expectancy, the expectancy of that resplendent star in which we were to vanish within the second. But there was no ruddy star. Instead, there was a sort of earthquake that splintered our cabin, ripped away the windows, blue sheets of metal hurtling through space 100 yards away, and filled our very entrails with its roar. The ship quivered like a knife blade thrown from a distance into a block of oak, and its anger mashed us as if we were so much pulp. 1 second, 2 seconds passed, and the plane still quivered, while I waited with a grotesque impatience for the forces within it to burst it like a bomb. But the subterranean quakings went on without a climax of eruption, while I marveled uncomprehendingly at its invisible travail. I was baffled by the quaking, the anger, the interminable postponement. 5 seconds passed. 6 seconds. And suddenly we were seized by a spinning motion, a shock that jerked our cigarettes out of the window, pulverized the starboard wing, and then nothing. Nothing but a frozen immobility. I shouted to Prévost, "Jump!" And in that instant he cried out, "Fire!" We dove together through the wrecked window, and found ourselves standing side by side 60 feet from the plane. I said, "Are you hurt?" He answered, "Not a bit." But he was rubbing his knee. "Better run your hands over yourself," I said. "Move about a bit. Sure no bones are broken?" He answered, "I'm all right. It's that emergency pump." Emergency pump. I was sure he was going to keel over any minute and split open from head to navel there before my eyes. But he kept repeating with a glassy stare, "That pump. That emergency pump." He's out of his head, I thought. He'll start dancing in a minute. Finally, he stopped staring at the plane, which had not gone up in flames, and stared at me instead, and he said again, "I'm all right. It's that emergency pump. It got me in the knee." Why we were not blown up, I do not know. I switched on my electric torch and went back over the furrow in the ground, traced by the plane. 250 yards from where we stopped, the ship had begun to shed the twisted iron and sheet metal that spattered the sand the length of her traces. We were to see, when day came, that we run almost tangentially into a gentle slope at the top of a barren plateau. At the point of impact there was a hole in the sand that looked as if it had been made by a plow. Maintaining an even keel, the plane had run its course with the fury and the tail lashings of a reptile, gliding on its belly at the rate of 170 miles an hour. We owed our lives to the fact that this desert was surfaced with round black pebbles, which had rolled over and over like ball bearings beneath us. They must have rained upward to the heavens as we shot through them. Prévost disconnected the batteries for fear of fire by short circuit. I leaned against the motor and turned the situation over in my mind. I had been flying high for 4 hours and a quarter, possibly with a 30-mile following wind. I had been jolted a good deal. If the wind had changed since the weather people forecasted, I was unable to say into what quarter it had veered. All I could make out was that we had crashed in an empty square, 250 miles on each side. Prévost came up and sat down beside me. "I can't believe that we are alive," he said. I said nothing. Even that thought could not cheer me. A germ of an idea was at work in my mind and was already bothering me. Telling Prévost to switch on his torch as a landmark, I walked straight out, scrutinizing the ground in the light of my own torch as I went. I went forward slowly, swung around in a wide arc, and changed direction a number of times. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, like a man hunting a lost ring. Only a little while before I had been straining just as hard to see the gleam of light from the air. Through the darkness I went, bowed over the traveling disk of white light. Just as I thought, I said to myself, and I went slowly back to the plane. I sat down beside the cabin and ruminated. I had been looking for a reason to hope, and had failed to find it. I had been looking for a sign of life, and no sign of life had appeared. Prévost, I couldn't find a single blade of grass. Prévost said nothing, and I was not sure he had understood. Well, we could talk about it again when the curtain rose at dawn. Meanwhile, I was dead tired, and all I could think was 250 miles more or less in the desert. Suddenly I jumped to my feet. "Water," I said. Gas tanks and oil tanks were smashed in. So was our supply of drinking water. The sand had drunk everything. We found a pint of coffee in a battered thermos flask, and half a pint of white wine in another. We filtered both and poured them into one flask. There were some grapes, too, and a single orange. Meanwhile, I was computing. All this will last us 5 hours of tramping in the sun. We crawled into the cabin and waited for dawn. I stretched out, and as I settled down to sleep, I took stock of our situation. We didn't know where we were. We had less than a quart of liquid between us. If we were not too far off the Benghazi Cairo lane, we should be found in a week, and that would be too late. Yet it was the best we could hope for. If, on the other hand, we had drifted off our course, we shouldn't be found in 6 months. One thing was sure, we could not count on being picked up by a plane. The men who came out for us would have 2,000 miles to cover. You know, it's a shame, Prévost said suddenly. What's a shame? That we didn't crash properly and have it over with. It seemed pretty early to be throwing in one's hand. Prévost and I pulled ourselves together. There was still a chance, slender as it was, that we might be saved miraculously by a plane. On the other hand, we couldn't stay here, and perhaps miss a nearby oasis. We would walk all day and come back to the plane before dark, and before going off we would write our plan in huge letters in the sand. With this, I curled up and settled down to sleep. I was happy to go to sleep. My weariness wrapped me round like a multiple presence. I was not alone in the desert. My drowsiness was peopled with voices and memories and whispered confidences. I was not yet thirsty. I felt strong, and I surrendered myself to sleep as to an aimless journey. Reality lost ground before the advance of dreams. But things were different when I awoke. In times past I have loved the Sahara. I have spent nights alone in the path of marauding tribes, and have walked up with untroubled mind in the golden emptiness of the desert, where the wind like a sea had raised sand waves upon its surface. Asleep under the wing of my plane, I have looked forward with confidence to being rescued next day. But this was not the Sahara. Prévost and I walked along the slopes of rolling mounds. The ground was sand covered with a single layer of shining black pebbles. They gleamed like metal scales, and all the domes about us shone like coats of mail. We had dropped down into a mineral world, and were hemmed in by iron hills. When we reached the top of the first crest, we saw in the distance another just like it, black and gleaming. As we walked, we scraped the ground with our boots, marking a trail over which to return to the plain. We went forward with the sun in our eyes. It was not logical to go due east like this, for everything, the weather reports, the duration of the flight, had made it plain that we had crossed the Nile. But I had started tentatively towards the west and felt the vague foreboding that I could not explain to myself. So I had put off the west till tomorrow. In the same way, provisionally, I had given up going north, though that led to the sea. 3 days later, when scourged by thirst into abandoning the plain and walking straight on until we dropped in our tracks, it was still eastward that we tramped. More precisely, we walked east-northeast. And this too was in defiance of all reason and even of all hope. Yet after we had been rescued, we discovered that if we had gone in any other direction, we should have been lost. Northward, we should never have had the endurance to reach the sea. And absurd as it may appear, it seems to me now, since I had no other motive, that I must have chosen the east simply because it was by going eastward that Guillaume had been saved in the Andes, after I had hunted for him everywhere. In a confused way, the east had become for me the direction of life. We walked on for 5 hours, and then the landscape changed. A river of sand seemed to be running through a valley, and we followed this riverbed, taking long strides in order to cover as much ground as possible and get back to the plain before night fell, if our march was in vain. Suddenly, I stopped. Prévost, what's up? Our tracks. How long was it since we had forgotten to leave a wake behind us? We had to find it or die. We went back, bearing to the right. When we had gone back far enough, we would make a right angle to the left and eventually intersect our tracks where we had still remembered to mark them. This we did, and were off again. The heat rose, and with it came the mirages. But these were still the commonplace kind, sheets of water that materialized and then vanished as we neared them. We decided to cross the valley of sand and climb the highest dome in order to look round the horizon. This was after 6 hours of march in which, striding along, we must have covered 20 miles. When we had struggled up to the top of the black hump, we sat down and looked at each other. At our feet lay our valley of sand, opening into a desert of sand whose dazzling brightness seared our eyes. As far as the eye could see lay empty space. But in that space the play of light created mirages which, this time, were of a disturbing kind. Fortresses and minarets, angular geometric hulks. I could see also a black mass that pretended to be vegetation, overhung by the last of those clouds that dissolve during the day only to return at night. This mass of vegetation was the shadow of a cumulus. It was no good going on. The experiment was a failure. We would have to go back to our plane, to that red and white beacon which perhaps would be picked out by a flyer. I was not staking great hopes on a rescue party, but it did seem to me our last chance of salvation. In any case, we had to get back to our few drops of liquid, for our throats were parched. We were imprisoned in this iron circle, captains of the curt dictatorship of thirst. And yet, how hard it was to turn back when there was a chance that we might be on the road to life. Beyond the mirages, the horizon was perhaps rich in veritable treasures, in meadows and runnels of sweet water. I knew I was doing the right thing by returning to the plain, and yet, as I swung round and started back, I was filled with portents of disaster.